Autumn Nanticoke greeted me with heavy rain and a graying sky. Droplets pounded on the roof of the cab as I surveyed the dreary streets of the small town that was now my new home. Or, rather, not really my home, the home of my son Leroy and his wife Nancy. The driver, an older man with gray in his temples, cast a sympathetic glance at me through the rearview mirror. "First time in Nanticoke, ma'am?" "Yes," I answered briefly, not wanting to go into details. I was 67 and without a home of my own for the first time in 40 years. After Harold, my husband, had died, living alone in the big house in Wilmington had become unbearable. Every corner, everything reminded me of him. Plus, maintaining the house required money, which I had less and less of when I retired. Selling the house seemed like a sensible solution. Some of the money went to pay off Harold's remaining debts and his medical treatment, and some I put aside for a rainy day. Leroy had offered to let me stay with them until I could decide what I wanted to do. At the time, it seemed ideal. "Here we are," the driver announced, pulling up in front of a two-story house with a small front garden. I paid, refusing to help with the suitcases. I was used to doing things on my own. While I was taking things out of the trunk, I mentally evaluated the house. It was nice. White walls, blue shutters, neat lawn, despite the fall. I helped Leroy put a down payment on this house 8 years ago. I'd insisted that I be listed as a co-borrower. It made it easier to get a better mortgage. It seemed like a formality at the time, but legally, I was a co-owner. The front door opened before I could ring the bell. There stood Leroy, my only son, a thin 39-year-old man with thinning blonde hair and eyes inherited from his father. "Mom!" He hugged me awkwardly as he accepted one of the suitcases. "How was your trip?" "Fine." I tried to smile. It was just raining. Leroy let me inside. The house was tastefully furnished, but with a woman's touch. Nancy was always on the lookout for fashion trends. The light-colored walls, minimalist furniture, decorative pillows, and potted artificial plants made it feel like a page from a magazine rather than a living home. "Nancy!" Leroy called out. "Mom's here." Nancy appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. My sister-in-law, a woman of 36, always looked impeccable brown hair-styled, makeup perfect, clothes picked out with the care of a fashion designer. Even now, at home, she wore slacks and a blouse, as if she were going to work, not cooking dinner. "Judith!" She smiled strainedly, making no attempt to hug me. "Welcome." I noticed the fleeting glance she gave my suitcases, a look of ill-concealed displeasure. "Thank you, Nancy." I nodded, feeling the muscles in my face tense from the fake smile. "This smells delicious." "Casserole." She jerked her shoulder. "Leroy, show Mom the house, and I'll finish dinner." Leroy led me through the first floor, a spacious living room with a kitchen, a small dining room, and a bathroom. The second floor consisted of a master bedroom, Leroy's office — he worked as an accountant in a construction company — and a guest room. "And this is where you'll live." Leroy hesitantly stopped in front of the guest room door, but didn't hurry to open it. "Only there's a little, renovation." "Renovations?" I raised my eyebrows. "You didn't say." "It was spontaneous." He rubbed his neck, a gesture he'd used since he was a kid when he lied. "We decided to update the wallpaper and change the hardwood floors. I'm sorry we didn't give you more notice." "Can I see it?" I reached for the doorknob. "I'd rather not." Leroy hurriedly stepped between me and the door. "It's such a mess in there now. Construction dust everywhere. You can't breathe." I looked at my son carefully. He looked away. "Where am I going to sleep?" I asked, feeling the irritation building up inside me. "We'll set up the couch in the living room." Leroy smiled faintly. "It's temporary, of course. The renovations will be finished in a week or two." I nodded silently. We both knew he was lying. Our uneasy relationship with Nancy began from the day we met. She was always wary, as if I were some kind of threat to her. I tried to connect, but Nancy built a wall of polite smiles and empty phrases between us. When she and Leroy got married, I'd hoped we'd grow closer over time, but instead, the wall only grew. After Harold died, I noticed that Nancy began to avoid visits and phone calls. Leroy came alone, making excuses for his wife's busy schedule. When I announced that I was selling the house and temporarily moving in with them, he was silent on the phone for a long time, then said they needed to confer with Nancy. A day later, he called back with a reluctant agreement. Now I understood why. At dinner, the conversation didn't go well. Nancy asked about the road and how the house sale had gone, but there was no genuine interest in her voice. Leroy kept the conversation moving, jumping from topic to topic. I answered briefly, watching my sister-in-law. She barely touched her food, as if she'd lost her appetite with my arrival. "How long do you plan to stay with us, Judith?" Nancy asked as we moved on to dessert, a store-bought apple pie. "Nancy," Leroy gave his wife a warning look. "What?" She shrugged innocently. "We need to plan if the renovations to the guest room take too long." "I don't want to be a burden," I interrupted, looking her straight in the eye. "As soon as I find a suitable apartment and get settled, I'll move in." "Mom, you're not a burden." Leroy put his hand on mine. "Stay as long as you need to." I noticed Nancy's lips tighten slightly, but I kept silent. After dinner, Leroy started to lay out the couch, and Nancy brought the bedding. I declined to help and made my temporary bed myself. When they left upstairs, I was finally alone. Opening my suitcase, I pulled out a framed photograph of Harold and set it on the coffee table. His smiling face reminded me of how good we'd been together. 42 years of marriage. We met when I worked at the post office, and he came to mail letters to his sick mother every week. One day he asked me out for coffee, and a year later, we were married. Leroy was born when we were 28. Harold always had a knack for smoothing things over and finding compromises. If he were alive, maybe things would have been different with Nancy. He would have gotten her to relax and accept me. But now I was alone, and I had to manage on my own. Out of curiosity, I went up to the second floor and walked quietly to the door of the guest room. The light was on in Leroy and Nancy's bedroom, and there were muffled voices. Carefully, she turned the guest room knob and peered inside. There were no repairs, of course. The room was used as storage: boxes of stuff, an exercise bike, a clothes dryer, an old computer desk. Nancy had clearly set up a storage area for anything that didn't fit into her perfect interior. No sign of any work in progress. No buckets of paint, no tools, no wallpaper removed. I closed the door quietly and walked back into the living room. Leroy's lies hurt but didn't surprise me. He'd always been weak-willed, preferring to avoid conflict even at the cost of the truth. As a child, it manifested itself in small things: blaming a broken vase on a non-existent neighbor boy, lying about his grades. As an adult, he learned to lie more skillfully, but I, as a mother, always saw right through him. I made my bed and lay down, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a strange house. Water dripped somewhere. The floorboards creaked. The refrigerator was running. The muffled voices of Leroy and Nancy came from upstairs. They were obviously arguing, though I couldn't make out the words. Before I went to sleep, I remembered how, 8 years ago, Leroy had called with the happy news that he and Nancy had found the house of their dreams, but the down payment was beyond their means. I had just received a small inheritance from my aunt and decided to help. $30,000 is a lot of money, but nothing is too much for my only son. I offered to become a co-borrower to get a more favorable mortgage rate. Leroy refused at first, but practical Nancy immediately agreed. The savings on interest over 30 years amounted to a decent sum. I signed the papers, gave them the money, and forgot all about it. They paid the mortgage faithfully, and I didn't interfere. To me, it was just helping my son, not an investment. I never reminded them of my contribution and legal rights to the house. Until today. Lying on the uncomfortable couch in the living room of the house I partially owned, I could feel the resentment building up inside. I had lost my husband, sold the house I had lived in most of my life, and come to the only person close to me, my son. And in return, I received lies and blatant dislike. Through the wall, I heard Nancy raise her voice. "She can't stay here much longer." Leroy's muffled reply. Then her again. "I don't care. Think of something." I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Memories swirled in my head. Little Leroy, his first bike, graduation, my wedding to Nancy, cold Christmas dinners, strained smiles. Somewhere along the way, I lost touch with my son. Or maybe I never really had one. As I fell asleep to the sound of rain drumming on the roof, I didn't know that the next few days would test not only my patience, but our entire family, and that soon I would have to make a decision that would change our relationship forever. The morning started with a bang. I woke up abruptly to the sound of falling pots and the clinking of breaking dishes. The clock on the wall read 6:30. It was just starting to get light outside the window. "Oh, I'm sorry." Nancy's voice sounded completely insincere. "I didn't mean to wake you, Judith." I sat up on the couch, wincing at the pain in my back. The third night on this torture device was taking its toll. Nancy stood in the kitchen, surrounded by fallen pans. She was wearing a tracksuit, her hair in a high ponytail. "It's no big deal." I tried to hide my irritation. It was time to get up anyway. "I was going for a run." She leaned over, picking up the scattered lids. "I usually make myself a protein shake, but I guess I'll have to do without it. I don't want to make noise again." The last phrase sounded so fake regretful that I could barely keep from rolling my eyes. For the third day in a row, Nancy found a way to wake me up early. The first day, she turned on the vacuum cleaner at 7 in the morning, right next to the couch, explaining it was to keep it clean. The second day, she dropped a stack of plates, accidentally elbowing them. I got up and started folding the bedding. Pajamas were the only thing I could leave in the living room. All my other belongings were neatly folded into suitcases that I slid behind the couch every night and slid back out every morning to retrieve what I needed. Nancy made it clear that she didn't want to see my things scattered around the house. "Sorry to take up your living room," I said, folding the quilt. "How are the renovations coming along?" Nancy froze for a second, then shrugged. "You know how it is. Workers promise to come and don't show up. Leroy called them yesterday, and they said they were delayed at another site." I nodded, determined not to catch her in a lie. Every evening when Leroy and Nancy left upstairs, I checked the guest room. Nothing had changed there in 3 days. The same boxes and junk. No sign of renovation. Nancy had gone for a run, slamming the door so hard the glass in the sideboard rattled. I was finally alone and able to shower and change without feeling like I was being watched. Leroy came downstairs at 7, already dressed for work, in gray slacks and a white shirt and tie. He smiled guiltily when he saw me at the table with a cup of tea. "Good morning, Mom. Did Nancy wake you up again?" "Nothing. I'm used to getting up early." I lied. In fact, since retiring, I'd been happy to stay in bed until 9 o'clock. "She didn't do it on purpose." Leroy started making himself some toast. "She's just used to being alone in the morning. I usually leave before her." I didn't say anything. I didn't want to start the morning with a conflict. "How's your apartment search going?" he asked, spreading jam on his toast. "No luck so far. The prices here are higher than I expected," I said. And the ones I can afford are in neighborhoods where it's scary to go out for bread in the evening. Leroy nodded without looking at me. Maybe we should look in neighboring towns. It should be cheaper there. I pressed my lips together. He hadn't even offered to stay with them for a while, until I found a good deal. I'll look, I answered briefly. Leroy finished his breakfast quickly, kissed me on the cheek, and left for work. I stayed in the empty house, not knowing what to do. I decided to at least do my laundry. It seemed harmless and useful. As I loaded the washer and started the program, my phone rang. It was an old friend, Betty, with whom we worked together at the post office. She still lived in Wilmington. "How are you settling in, Judith?" she asked me after an exchange of greetings. "Not very well, to be honest." I lowered my voice, though there was no one else in the house. Nancy was obviously not happy to see me. I knew it. Betty had always disliked my sister-in-law, thinking she was arrogant. "What's she doing?" "Nothing concrete yet. She's just making inconvenience. Waking me up in the morning, giving me the stink eye when I use something in the kitchen. You know, little things that individually don't mean anything, but together they get on your nerves." And Leroy? As usual, he pretends not to notice. You know my son, he avoids conflict at all costs. We talked some more. Betty invited me to come stay with her if things got too rough. I thanked her, but declined. I didn't want to admit defeat and run away. After we talked, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The day was sunny, though cool. The neighborhood where Leroy and Nancy lived was a typical American suburb. Neat houses with manicured lawns, two-car garages, swings and slides in the backyards of those who had children. I couldn't help wondering why Leroy and Nancy still didn't have children. They had gotten married 10 years ago, both wanting a family. At least that's what Leroy said. Maybe that was the cause of the tension between them, too. And maybe my presence was only adding to the stress. When I got home by noon, I found that my laundry was done, but the laundry was still in the machine. I pulled the clothes out and hung them on the dryer in the backyard. Thank goodness the weather was cooperating. As I passed the living room, I noticed that the picture of Harold I'd put on the coffee table was gone. Looking around the room, I found it pushed behind a vase of artificial flowers. It was a small thing, but it struck a nerve. I returned the photo to its original place and decided not to say anything. After lunch, which I made for myself from food bought with my own money, Nancy had made it clear that I had to buy my own food. I went to check the laundry. To my horror, the blouse I'd hung in the center was stained with something red. It looked like juice or wine. The stains were only on her. The rest of her clothes were still clean, which ruled out a fluke. I stood there, clutching the ruined blouse, one of my favorites, and felt the anger building inside. This was getting out of hand. That evening, when Leroy came home from work, I tried to talk to him alone, but Nancy, as if sensing danger, wouldn't leave his side. She was fussing in the kitchen, preparing dinner, constantly asking Leroy to help with one thing or another. At dinner, the atmosphere was especially tense. Nancy served lasagna, which was oversalted beyond belief. I made a couple of polite compliments, but after a few bites, I set my fork aside, unable to continue. "You don't like it?" Nancy raised an eyebrow. "A little salty for me." I tried to soften the criticism with a smile. "But overall, it's delicious." "You must have age-related changes in your taste buds." Nancy grinned. My grandmother also complained that food was either bland or oversalted when she was in her 60s. I noticed Leroy tense up, but he remained silent as he continued to chew his portion methodically. "Maybe," I agreed, deciding not to be provoked. "By the way, Leroy, do you know who might have stained my blouse while it was drying? It was perfectly clean when I hung it up." Leroy looked at me confused. "What blouse?" "My beige one with the floral pattern. It had red stains on it like wine or juice." "I have no idea." He shrugged. "Birds, Or did the wind bring something from the neighbors' lots? Nancy watched me carefully. Her eyes narrowed. I'm afraid we don't have any birds that shit red in our neighborhood, I said, and I didn't notice any red bushes or trees on the neighbors on the left, and the neighbors on the right have gone on vacation, their house empty. It must have happened when you were hanging up your blouse, Nancy interjected. Maybe you already had something red on your hands, or did you lean against something without noticing? I met her gaze. We both knew she was lying. Maybe, I said after a pause. The memory isn't what it used to be. There was an awkward silence, which Leroy broke by talking about problems at work. I listened, half listening, still digesting what had happened with the blouse. It wasn't just passive aggression anymore, but actual property damage. After dinner, Nancy suddenly jumped up as if she'd had an epiphany. I've got an idea. She looked at Leroy, then at me. Judith, you love nature, don't you? I nodded warily. I'd never been much of a nature lover, but I didn't hate it either. What if you lived in a tent in the backyard? Nancy continued enthusiastically. We have a great 4-person tent that we bought for camping last year. It's spacious and you'll have your own personal space. No one will wake you up in the morning. I stared at her, not believing my ears. She was suggesting that I, a 67-year-old woman, live in a tent in October? Nancy, are you serious? I looked at Leroy, expecting him to pull his wife aside, but instead, my son nodded thoughtfully. You know, there's something to it, he said, avoiding my gaze. The tent is really comfortable. We slept in it on Lake Erie, and it was even freezing, but it was warm inside. We have an air mattress, a sleeping bag. Leroy, it's October outside, I reminded him, still hoping this was some kind of bad joke. But it's still warm during the day, he countered. We can give you a heater at night. It's safe, it's battery operated, and you can use the bathroom in the house, of course. It's a temporary solution until the renovations are finished, Nancy added. I can even set up a cozy space in there with a rug and battery-operated lights. I looked at one and the other, trying to comprehend what was happening. My own son, whom I had given life to, raised, educated, listened to thousands of childhood problems, and helped buy this very house, was now telling me, "You're going to sleep in a tent in the backyard." Not an ounce of shame on his face, just a guilty look, not because of the absurdity of the suggestion, but because he was afraid of my reaction. You want me to live in a tent? I repeated, giving them a chance to come to their senses. Only until the repairs are finished, Leroy hastened to assure me. A week at the most, a week that would never end, because there were no repairs. I exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. My first impulse was to say what I thought of both of them, take my things and leave. But where to? To Betty's in Wilmington? Get a motel room until I could find an apartment? Spend the money I had set aside for a rainy day? And then it hit me. I remembered my title to this house, the papers I signed 8 years ago, my co-borrower status. I looked at Nancy and smiled. She tensed up a little, a reaction I hadn't expected. You know, I said, that's a great idea. I love new experiences. After all, at my age, you have to try something different while you can. Really? Nancy didn't hide her surprise. She was obviously expecting a scandal. Of course, I nodded. When else are we going to get a chance to live in a tent? I'm sure it will be an unforgettable experience. Leroy looked both relieved and confused. Then I'll go and set it up right away, he said, getting up from the table. Nancy, will you give me a hand? They went out to the backyard, and I stayed at the table, watching them work on the tent out the window. Inside me, a plan was brewing, a plan that would teach them a lesson they would never forget. I wasn't going to meekly accept humiliation. I wasn't going to put up with the way they treated me, Not after everything I'd done for Leroy. Not after I helped them buy this house. A house that partially belonged to me. It was time to remind them of that fact. I spent the night in a tent in the backyard. The sleeping bag Leroy had given me was warm, but the ground beneath the air mattress felt like stone. I barely slept a wink, listening to the rustles of the night garden and watching the first rays of dawn seep through the fabric of the tent. Surprisingly, I didn't feel tired in the morning. On the contrary, I was overwhelmed with determination. While Leroy and Nancy were still asleep, I quietly made my way into the house, showered, and changed my clothes. Then I made myself a strong cup of coffee and pulled out of my suitcase the file folder I always carried with me. Among the birth certificates, insurance, and medical records, I found what I was looking for: the papers for the house. A mortgage agreement that said in black and white that I, Judith Bridgeworth, was a co-borrower and had equal rights to the property with Leroy Bridgeworth. The papers I had signed 8 years ago to help my son. Looking through the papers, I remembered how Leroy and Nancy had come to see me and Harold, excited and happy, with pictures of the house they had just found. How they talked about their plans to furnish it, about the nursery they wanted to make into a small room next to the master bedroom, about the backyard where family barbecues would be held. "Only we don't have enough for a down payment," Leroy said then. "The bank requires 20%, or the terms will be terrible." They didn't ask directly, but the hint was clear. I glanced over at Harold. We'd just received an inheritance from my Aunt Marge, not a huge sum, but enough to help my son. "We could lend you the money for the down payment," Harold suggested. "And I could be a co-borrower," I added. "That way you'd get a better interest rate." Leroy started to hesitate, but Nancy quickly agreed. "That would be terrific," she said with an uncommon warmth. "We'll get every cent back, I promise." We didn't have to return anything. Harold and I decided it would be our gift. I had signed all the papers and forgotten about it, thinking that co-ownership of the house was a mere formality. Now that formality gave me real power. I put the papers back in the folder and waited for Leroy and Nancy to wake up. The wait wasn't long. Soon I heard footsteps on the stairs. Nancy was the first to come down, fully dressed and perfectly styled, as if she were going to a business meeting rather than a normal day at work. She froze for a second when she saw me at the kitchen table. "Good morning," she said coolly. "How did you sleep in the tent?" "Delicious," I smiled. "Fresh air does wonders." She looked at me incredulously, but remained silent, heading for the coffee maker. While she was pouring her coffee, Leroy showed up, wrinkled and obviously sleep-deprived. "Mom?" He looked at me in surprise. "You're up already?" "I've never slept so early," I replied. "Leroy, Nancy, I'd like to talk to you." "I have to go to work." Nancy glanced at her watch. "How about tonight?" "It's important." I put my hand on the file folder. "It won't take long." Leroy and Nancy looked at each other. Something in my voice made them wary. "Okay." Nancy reluctantly sat down across from me. "What did you want to talk about?" I opened the folder and pulled out the documents. "Do you remember under what circumstances this house was purchased?" Leroy frowned. "Of course I remember. You and Dad helped us with the down payment." "Not only that," I put the mortgage agreement in front of them, "I also became a co-borrower so you could get a better interest rate." Nancy tensed up. "What's your point, Judith?" "My point," I tapped my finger on the deed, "is that legally I am part owner of this house. I have the same rights to this property as you do." There was silence. Leroy stared at the papers in confusion, and Nancy paled visibly. "But it was just a formality," Leroy said at last. "We've always paid the mortgage ourselves." "Yes, we did," I nodded, "and I never interfered in your affairs. I thought you owned the house, even though legally it wasn't exactly true. Nancy stood up abruptly, spilling her coffee. What's this all about? You want to take the house away from us? After all these years? No, I shook my head. I want to remind you that when you suggest I live in a tent in the backyard of a house I partially own, you're overstepping your bounds. Leroy lowered his eyes, clearly feeling uncomfortable. Mom, it was just a suggestion. We didn't force you to. You practically put me out on the street. I raised my voice, unable to hold back any longer. Your wife ruined my blouse, hid your father's picture, woke me up every morning, and did everything to make me feel unwelcome here. And you, my own son, instead of protecting my mother, you supported her. I didn't ruin your blouse, Nancy exclaimed. And I didn't touch the picture. Don't lie to my face. I looked at her coldly. We all know the truth. Leroy looked from me to his wife, not knowing who to support. Look, let's all calm down, he began in his conciliatory tone that he always used in conflict situations. Mom, no one meant to hurt you. We were just looking for a solution that would work for everyone. A solution that would please everyone? I grinned bitterly. Sending a 67-year-old woman to live in a tent in October? That's your solution? Nancy crossed her arms over her chest. Judith, you agreed to it. You said you liked it. I lied, I shrugged, just like you lied to me about the renovations in the guest room. Leroy flinched. You know? Of course I know. I check the room every night. There are no renovations in there, just your junk. Nancy threw an angry glance at Leroy, as if accusing him of failing to trick me. So what now? She asked tensely. Are you going to bill us for our lodging? No. I took a deep breath and said the words I'd been preparing all morning. I want you both out of this house within 3 days. There was a deafening silence. Leroy stared at me as if I'd suddenly spoken in an alien language. What? He finally said. You heard me? I tried to speak firmly, though I was trembling inside. I'm exercising my right as co-owner, and I demand that you move out. Nancy laughed, but there was no mirth in her laugh. You can't just take us out. We have rights. So do I. I pointed to the papers. And I consulted a lawyer. Since I'm a co-owner and you violated our verbal agreement on family relations, I have the right to demand your eviction. That was a lie. I didn't consult any lawyer. But I knew enough about the law to realize that the situation was really complicated and there was no easy solution. However, I was counting on Leroy and Nancy not checking my word and calling lawyers. You're bluffing, Nancy narrowed her eyes. Check, I shrugged. Just be aware that the legal proceedings could drag on for months, if not years. In the meantime, we'll be living together. Me in the tent, of course. I saw Nancy turn even paler. The prospect of a long life with me clearly frightened her more than the possibility of eviction. Leroy finally came out of his daze. Mom, you can't seriously be suggesting this. Where are we going to go? I don't know. I looked him straight in the eye. Maybe to the tent in the backyard? Nancy jumped up, knocking over a chair. This is ridiculous. We've been paying for this house for 8 years, every month without fail. And I'm grateful for that, I nodded. But the house is still partly mine, and I don't want to live with people who don't respect me anymore. Mom, Leroy looked at me pleadingly. Let's talk about this. We can find a compromise. We'll vacate the guest room tonight. I'll move everything into the garage myself. Too late, I shook my head. You've already shown your true feelings for me. It was Nancy, Leroy exclaimed, earning a searing look from his wife. She suggested the tent, not me. I just backed her up because I didn't want to argue. Fine, Nancy hissed. Blame it on me. That's very masculine. But it's true. Leroy turned to her. You've been against Mom coming here from the beginning. You kept saying we had to find a way to get rid of her. I watched their fight unfold with mixed feelings. On the one hand, it hurt me to hear Nancy talk about me. On the other, I felt a sense of satisfaction that their relationship was beginning to crack at the seams. I never said, get rid of, Nancy raised her voice. I said we needed to find another place for her to live. What's wrong with that? You offered to let her live in a tent. Leroy splashed his hands. In a tent, Nancy, my elderly mother. You agreed. Nancy jabbed her finger at his chest. Don't pretend you had nothing to do with it. I coughed, interrupting their altercation. I've given you 3 days. Use them wisely. Find a new place to live. Pack your things. Monday, I want you out of here. You can't do that. Nancy turned to me, her eyes burning with rage. We'll sue you. You can try. I calmly gathered the papers back into the folder. But believe me, I have a better chance of winning. I'm an old woman who's been kicked out by her own son and daughter-in-law to live in a tent. Whose side do you think the court will be on? Leroy sank down in his chair, covering his face with his hands. Mom, please, let's find another way out. I found a way out. I stood up. Now it's your turn to look for a new place to live. Leroy, don't beg her. Nancy grabbed the bag. We're not going anywhere. She can call the police if she wants. And I will, I nodded, if I have to. Nancy gave me a hateful look and stormed out of the kitchen. A few seconds later, the front door slammed. Leroy and I were alone. He looked up at me with reddened eyes. Why are you doing this? Why did you offer to let me live in a tent? I parried. It was stupid. He shook his head. I should have told Nancy right away that it was unacceptable. But I didn't, I sighed. And you know what the saddest part is? You've always done this, Leroy. You've always taken the path of least resistance. As a kid, when you were bullied by other boys. As a teenager, when you had to stand up for yourself. In adulthood, when your wife started bossing you around. That's not fair. He frowned. Nancy and I have an equal relationship. Really? I looked at him skeptically. Then why did you agree to evict your own mother to the tent instead of insisting on vacating the guest room? Leroy was silent, unable to find an answer. I gave you 3 days, I repeated. Use them wisely. Mom, please. He grabbed my hand. We can fix this. I'll talk to Nancy. We'll find a way to live together. It's too late. I gently released his hand. Sometimes you have to face the consequences of your decisions to truly change. But where are we going to go? He sounded desperate. We don't have the savings for a new down payment. Rent is costing an insane amount of money right now. I don't know, I shrugged. Maybe Nancy's parents could help? Leroy grinned bitterly. Her parents are barely making ends meet. Plus, they live in a tiny apartment in Florida. Then we'll have to look for other options, I said as I headed out of the kitchen. And you know, I really like the tent. I think I'll stay there a couple more nights while you guys get ready to leave. I don't want to create an awkward atmosphere in the house. It was a small revenge to show that even the tent was better than their company. Leroy flinched as if from a slap. Mother, I'm going for a walk. I cut him off. I'll be back for dinner. As I left the house, I took a deep breath of the fresh fall air. Conflicting feelings raged inside me. The bitterness of my son's betrayal, the satisfaction of revenge, and a strange relief, as if I'd shed a heavy weight I'd been carrying for years. As I passed my neighbor's house, I noticed an elderly woman sweeping the porch. She waved me over with a friendly wave. Good morning. You must be Leroy's mom. I'm Delilah Hammond. I live next door. Judith Bridgeworth, I came closer. Yes, I'm Leroy's mom. It's very nice to meet you, she smiled. How long have you been here? A few days ago, I answered, but there will be changes here soon. Is that so? Delilah looked at me with interest. Yes, I nodded. Leroy and Nancy are moving out, and I'm staying. Delilah raised her eyebrows in surprise, but didn't ask further. Well, if you need company or help, I live right here, she pointed to her house. My husband died 3 years ago, so I understand what it's like to be alone. Thank you, I smiled sincerely. Perhaps I'll take you up on your offer. As I continued my walk, I reflected on what had happened this morning. Part of me felt guilty that I had effectively left my son homeless, but another part, a stronger part, reminded me that this is exactly what they were going to do to me. The only difference was that I had legal rights to the house, and their solution was just cruel caprice. When I got home for dinner, I found that Leroy had left, apparently for work. The house was quiet. I peeked into the guest room and saw that Leroy had started to clear out the debris. Several boxes were already standing in the hallway. It was too late. I made myself a light lunch and sat at the table, looking out the window at the tent in the yard, a symbol of my humiliation that was now a symbol of my victory. I thought about what would happen next, about how Leroy and Nancy would react when they realized I wasn't kidding, about whether I was really ready to put them out on the street. And somewhere deep inside, behind all the determination and anger, I hoped that Leroy would find the strength to truly apologize, not just with words, but with actions, that he would finally become a man who wasn't afraid to stand up to injustice, even if it came from his beloved wife. But years of experience told him that would not happen, that Leroy would still look for the easy way out, and that my intransigence was the only way to make him grow up. I've decided I won't back down, even if it hurt both of us. 3 days went by faster than I expected. At first, Leroy and Nancy pretended not to take my threats seriously. Nancy defiantly ignored me, walking by with her head held high. Leroy tried to speak several times, but I remained adamant. Mom, you can't really evict us, he said, rubbing his neck nervously. This is our house. Our home, I corrected him. And yes, I can. By the end of the second day, they finally realized I wasn't backing down. I could hear them arguing late into the bedroom, their voices growing louder and louder until Nancy burst into sobs. On the third day, they started packing. I watched from the kitchen window as Leroy loaded suitcases into the trunk of their used sedan. Nancy stood beside me, arms crossed over her chest, saying something through clenched teeth. From the look on her face, it was nothing pleasant. It was Monday morning, my deadline. I decided not to go out so as not to make another scene. What happened last night was enough. Sunday evening, Nancy burst into the kitchen, where I was quietly drinking tea, and threw a stack of printouts on the table. You can't evict us, she announced. I consulted a lawyer. Even if you're a co-borrower, you don't have the right to solely decide who lives in the house. I calmly set my cup aside. What does your lawyer suggest? Litigation, Nancy smiled smugly, which could take months, if not years. In the meantime, we'd be living here. I shrugged. I'm fine with that. I'm quite comfortable in the tent. I can live there while the trial goes on. Her face contorted with rage. You wouldn't dare. What will the neighbors think? That my daughter-in-law and son evicted me into the tent. I sipped my tea calmly. Can you imagine the headlines in the local newspapers? Elderly woman forced to live in a tent in her own backyard. I'm sure the reporters would love to interview me. Nancy turned pale. Her work in real estate was built on reputation. A scandal of this magnitude could seriously damage her career. You won't do it, she lowered her voice. Why not? You put me in the tent. It was just an idea, she exclaimed. You agreed voluntarily. And the court will decide whether a 67-year-old mother was forced to live in a tent or not. I raised my eyebrows. Do you want to risk it? Nancy clenched her fists, but didn't say anything. After a few seconds, she turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard that the glass rattled on the sideboard. Now, looking out the window at their departure, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: satisfaction that justice had been served, bitterness at being separated from my only son, and the sudden relief of no longer having to endure Nancy's coldness, no longer having to pretend that everything was all right. Leroy slammed the trunk shut and turned toward the house. Our gazes met through the glass. He raised his hand in a hesitant gesture, either to say goodbye or to apologize. I didn't respond. I just turned away and walked away from the window. When I returned to the window a few minutes later, the car was gone. I was alone in the house that was now mine alone. The first thing I did was go upstairs and go into the guest room, which was supposedly being renovated. Nancy had taken most of the stuff away, but some boxes remained. I started taking them apart, determined to turn this room into my bedroom. In one of the boxes, I found old photo albums, pictures of Leroy as a child, his school pictures, family holidays, Harold, still young and full of life, hugging little Leroy on the beach, myself with dark hair without a single gray, smiling at the camera, holding my son's 5th birthday cake. Where and when did we lose that connection? When did Leroy stop being a boy who came to me with all his problems and become a man who chooses to live with a woman who despises his mother? Putting the scrapbooks aside, I continued cleaning. By evening, the room was almost ready. I moved my clothes from the suitcases into an empty closet, put fresh linens on a bed I found under a pile of boxes. It was a small single bed, apparently left over from the previous owners, but it seemed like paradise after the couch in the living room and the tent in the backyard. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on the door. On the doorstep stood Delilah Hammond, a neighbor I had met a few days earlier. She was holding a basket of scones. "Good morning, Judith," she smiled. "I thought you might like to keep me company at breakfast. I made blueberry muffins, my signature recipe." I gratefully invited her in. After 3 days of intense confrontation with Leroy and Nancy, the company of a friendly person was a breath of fresh air. Delilah proved to be a wonderful conversationalist. A 72-year-old widow with a sharp mind and a great sense of humor, she had lived in Nanticoke all her life and knew all the local stories. Her husband Frank died 3 years ago of cancer, and since then she had lived alone, supported by 2 grown daughters who visited her regularly. "I noticed Leroy and Nancy are gone," she said, buttering her muffin. "For how long?" "Forever," I answered, and on a sudden impulse, I told her the whole story. Delilah listened intently, not interrupting. When I finished, she shook her head. Offering an old woman to live in a tent. What a time. "Don't you think I was too cruel?" I asked, still plagued by doubts. "Cruel?" Delilah snorted. "Honey, they got what they deserved. In my day, children were taught to respect their parents. Your son seems to have missed that lesson." Her words brought me some relief. I wasn't sure if I'd done the right thing, but Delilah's encouragement made me feel less guilty. "They're at a motel on the outskirts of town," I said. "Leroy sent a text last night, the only thing they can afford. It's the right thing to do." Delilah nodded. "Let them feel what it's like to be homeless. Maybe it will teach them to appreciate what they have." After breakfast, Delilah offered to show me around town. I was happy to accept. The few days I'd spent with Leroy and Nancy had left me with very little to look around. Nanticoke was a charming little town, with a historic center with 19th century buildings and modern neighborhoods on the outskirts. Delilah showed me around the library, the senior community center where various activities were held, and her favorite candy store. "If you decide to stay in Nanticoke, you should know all the best places to go," she said, treating me to a delicious cheesecake at a cozy cafe. "I haven't decided yet," I admitted. It had all happened so suddenly. I hadn't planned to stay here for long. Well, now you have a home and at least one friend. Delilah winked. Not a bad start, I'd say. When I got home that evening, I found a message from Leroy on my answering machine. Mom, please call me back. We need to talk. Nancy and we're having problems. I want to apologize. Please. His voice sounded choked, almost desperate. I felt a prick of pity, but I didn't call back. It was too soon. The wound was too fresh. The next day, I decided to put the whole house in order. Nancy always made sure it was clean, but I wanted to make the place my own. I rearranged the living room furniture, added some pillows to the couch, changed the curtains. I put Harold's picture in the most prominent place on the mantelpiece in the living room. In the evening, Leroy called again. This time, I answered the phone. Mom? His voice sounded surprised, as if he didn't expect me to answer. Yes, Leroy. How are you? He asked after a pause. I'm fine, I answered guardedly. And you? Not so good, he sighed. The motel's awful, noisy, cramped, mold on the walls. Nancy hardly ever talks to me. She says it's all my fault. Isn't it? I asked, trying to keep my emotions in check. Yes, he agreed abruptly. I should have protected you. I should have insisted that you live in the house properly. Yeah, I chickened out, Mom. His confession took me by surprise. Leroy rarely admitted his mistakes. I'm sorry it's come to this, I said after a pause. I'm sorry too. I could hear the sincere sadness in his voice. But now I don't know what to do. Nancy says we should sue you. I don't want that. I just want things to get better. Things aren't going to get better if we sue, I said. I know, he sighed. But what are we going to do? We can't live in a motel forever. I felt a prick of conscience. Despite everything that had happened, Leroy was still my son. But I also remembered how he'd supported the idea of evicting me to a tent. You need to find a new place to live, I said firmly. An apartment, a house, anything. You work, Nancy works. You'll be fine. We can't buy a new house without a down payment, he argued. And rent is crazy expensive right now. We can barely afford this motel. Then you're going to have to do something. I tried to sound calm, even though his desperation made me squeeze inside. Maybe move temporarily to another city where it's cheaper? Nancy doesn't want to leave Nanticoke, Leroy said. All her customers are here. Well, then she'll have to face reality. I cut him off. You don't live in this house anymore. There was a long pause. I understand, Leroy said finally. It's just, can I call you sometimes? Just to talk? I softened. You can, Leroy. You're still my son. After the conversation, I sat looking at Harold's picture for a long time. What would he say about what I'd done? Would he approve or disapprove? Harold had always been softer than me, always looking for compromise. But even he would not have tolerated such treatment. Over the next few days, I slowly settled into the house. Delilah became a frequent guest. We cooked dinner together, watched old movies, reminisced about our youth. She introduced me to other older women from Nanticoke, Eleanor, a former literature teacher, and Ruth, who had worked in the library all her life. We formed a small club, meeting at one or the other's house for tea parties and endless conversation. A week after Leroy and Nancy left, Betty called me from Wilmington. How are you, Judith? Did you survive your sister-in-law? I laughed and told her the whole story. Betty oohed, resented, and finally declared, You did the right thing. I should have taught them a lesson a long time ago. Sometimes I feel guilty, I confessed. After all, Leroy is my son. The son who let his wife evict you to the tent, Betty reminded me. That doesn't sound very sonly. But they really are in a tough spot, I sighed. living in some awful motel, no money for a new house. They're adults, Betty said. They'll figure it out. You can't spend your life dealing with Leroy's problems. She was right, but I couldn't let go of the guilt. That same night, I called Leroy again. "How are you?" I asked. "Not so good." His voice sounded tired. Nancy had filed for divorce. I gasped. I hadn't expected that. "Why?" "She says I failed to protect our home and our family." Leroy grinned bitterly. "That if I'd been a real man, I wouldn't have let you kick us out. Or wouldn't have let her offer to let you live in a tent. Anyway, no matter what I do, I'm always wrong." "I'm sorry," I said, and it was the truth. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't want to ruin my son's marriage. "You shouldn't," he sighed. "I think our marriage was doomed before you got here. It was just the last straw." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." He paused. "I'll probably have to move to another city. It's too expensive to rent a place here alone." "What about your job?" "I'm an accountant, Mom. Accountants are needed everywhere," he said with a faint smile. After the conversation, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The events were moving so fast and taking a turn I hadn't expected. I wanted to teach Leroy and Nancy a lesson, but not destroy their marriage. Although, to be honest with myself, their relationship had always struck me as odd. Nancy was dominant, Leroy was submissive. Maybe the divorce really was for the best. The next day, I told Delilah about the news as we strolled through the park. "I'm not surprised," she shook her head. "Women like Nancy always look for blame around them, but never in the mirror." "But I feel responsible," I admitted. "If I hadn't kicked them out—" "What?" Delilah interrupted. "Would you have lived in a tent while they continued their toxic marriage? Or would you have found an apartment and moved out, leaving Leroy under that woman's thumb? Sometimes it takes a crisis to see the truth. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had unwittingly done Leroy a favor by forcing him to look at his life and relationships from a different angle." 2 weeks after the eviction, I received a letter from Nancy, a formal notice that she was hiring an attorney to settle the property division issue. She was demanding compensation for her share of the house, calculated as the sum of all her mortgage payments for 8 years. I showed the letter to Delilah, who advised me to get a lawyer, too. "Don't let her intimidate you," my friend said. "She's trying to squeeze as much money out of the situation as possible." I took her advice and contacted a local lawyer specializing in family law. He assured me that Nancy's claims had little chance of success, given the circumstances of our conflict and the fact that I was a legal co-borrower. While the lawyers exchanged letters, I continued to settle into my new life, made friends with Ruth at the library, and began helping out there as a volunteer twice a week. Met with Delilah, Eleanor, and the other women of our club for dinners and card games. Got a cat, a gray 3-year-old female from the local shelter, whom I named Pearl after my grandmother. Leroy called regularly every few days. Our conversations were becoming less strained, though still far from easy. He had found a job in a neighboring town and was planning a move. "Nancy's pushing to sell the house," he said one evening. "Says she's owed half the value." "What do you think?" I asked cautiously. "I don't think she has the right to do that," he said with sudden firmness. "The house legally belongs to you and me, and I don't want to sell it." "But you can't live in it," I pointed out. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't want her to get the money for a house you helped buy, not her." It was the first time Leroy had openly sided with me against Nancy. I felt a surge of pride and hope. Maybe my son was finally learning to stand his ground. One evening, about a month after the eviction, Delilah came to me with a bottle of wine and a proposal. "I've been thinking," she said, pouring wine into glasses. "Your house has 3 bedrooms, and you live alone. My house has 4 bedrooms, and I'm alone too. It's ridiculous. What are you suggesting?" I looked at her with interest. What if Eleanor, Ruth, and I moved in with you, or you to one of us? We'd create a sort of commune for the golden age. I laughed, but I found the idea suddenly appealing. Living alone was nice, but sometimes lonely, and the company of these women, with whom I had developed a warm relationship, could make life more fulfilling. You know, it's not such a bad idea, I said, sipping my wine. I need to think about the details, but overall, I like it. That's great. Delilah glowed. I've already talked to the girls, and they're interested too. Imagine how much we'll save on utilities, groceries, and it's safer together. We spent the evening discussing the possibilities of living together. To my surprise, I like the idea more and more. Maybe evicting Leroy and Nancy was not the end, but the beginning of something new and better in my life. That night, lying in bed, I reflected on how strange things had turned out. A month ago, I had been a homeless widow, forced to live with a son and daughter-in-law who didn't want to see me. Now I had my own home, new friends, and plans for the future that seemed brighter and more interesting than anything I could have imagined after Harold's death. I was still grieving the breakup with Leroy and the way things had gone down. But maybe this ordeal was what we both needed, me to find a new life, and him to finally grow up and learn to stand up for himself. As I fell asleep, I thought of Harold. What would he say if he saw me now? Perhaps he'd be surprised at my determination, perhaps saddened by the conflict with his son, but I was sure he would be happy to see me find new joy and purpose in life. Everything will be all right, Harold, I whispered into the darkness. And with Leroy, too. He's stronger than we thought. It had been 3 months since I'd evicted Leroy and Nancy from the house. It's been a mild winter in Nanticoke, with occasional snowfalls and mostly gray skies. Our Golden Age Club, as Delilah jokingly called it, was thriving. Delilah, Eleanor, Ruth, and I regularly gathered at my house or one of them for dinners, board games, and just heartfelt conversations. That January morning, I had just finished breakfast when Leroy called. We kept in touch, calling once a week. Our conversations were polite but superficial. He talked about his new job in a neighboring town. I shared updates on my life in Nanticoke. We both avoided mentioning Nancy and the conflict that had led to the current situation. Mom? His voice sounded different than usual, more strained. There's something I need to tell you. What's wrong? I tensed, expecting bad news. Nancy and I are officially divorced. We signed the final papers yesterday. I slowly sank back into my chair. Even though I knew they'd filed for divorce, part of me still hoped they could get through the crisis and save the marriage. I'm sorry, Leroy, I said sincerely. Don't be, he sighed. It's probably for the best. The last few months had shown me that our marriage was based on my constant pleasing of her. I'm tired of living like this. I remained silent, not knowing what to say. I didn't want to express relief that he'd finally realized the toxicity of his relationship with Nancy. She's moving to Florida to live with her parents, Leroy continued. She sold her real estate agency and decided to make a fresh start. What about her claim to a piece of the house? I asked, remembering Nancy's threats to sue. She gave them up in exchange for me taking over our joint debts, Leroy answered. I think she just wanted to get it over with. I understand, I said quietly. How are you doing now? I'm fine, he said, a hesitant note in his voice. Actually, I was wondering, could I come visit you this weekend, just to talk? I hesitated. Over the months, I'd created a new life, one where there was no room for old resentments and conflicts. But Leroy was still my son, my only child. Of course, I agreed. Come over on Saturday for lunch. On Saturday, I nervously prepared for Leroy's visit. I baked his favorite apple pie and made a roast, a dish he'd loved since he was a kid. Delilah stopped by this morning to cheer me on. Don't let him pity you, she advised as she helped me set the table. He's a grown man who's made his own choices. I know, I sighed, but he's still my son. That's why you have to be firm. Delilah put her hand on my shoulder. Otherwise, nothing will change. Leroy arrived at 2 sharp. When I opened the door, I hardly recognized him. He'd lost weight, grown a beard, and there was something new in his eyes, a confidence that hadn't been there before. Hi, Mom. He hugged me, and I felt something inside me tremble. Despite everything that had happened, I missed him. Hello, Leroy. I pulled away first. Come on in. Dinner's almost ready. He looked around, noticing the changes in the house new curtains, rearranged furniture, pictures on the walls. It's cozy, he said, taking off his jacket. I've tried to make this place my own, I replied, leading him into the kitchen. Over lunch, we talked about neutral topics, his new job, my library classes, the weather in Nanticoke. He told me he was renting a small apartment near the office and was slowly settling into his new place. Have you made any friends? I asked as I served dessert. A couple of coworkers we sometimes go out for a beer with. He shrugged. Nothing serious. You have a busy social life, don't you? I told him about Delilah, Eleanor, and Ruth, about our regular meetings and future plans. You know, we're thinking about living together, I shared. 4 single women our age, each in her own big house, isn't very practical. Together? Leroy raised his eyebrows in surprise. Here? Maybe, I nodded. We're still deciding whose house is the best fit. Delilah's is the biggest, but it's 2 stories, which isn't ideal for older people. Ruth has a lovely 1-story house, but only 2 bedrooms. What about me? The question was asked so quietly that I didn't immediately realize what he'd said. What do you mean? If you all live here, where will I live? He looked at me with a kind of childish helplessness. When all this is over. When what's over? I frowned. Our conflict. Leroy set his fork aside. Mom, I came to apologize. I was wrong to let Nancy treat you like that. I was wrong to go along with the tent idea. I understand why you were angry and kicked us out. But now that Nancy's gone, can't we start over? I stared at him, trying to realize what he was suggesting. A fresh start? What do you mean? I want to go home, he said bluntly. To our home. To live here, with you, like before. I was silent, not knowing what to say. Part of me, the maternal part of me, wanted to agree, to forget all the hurt and let my son come back. But the other part of me, the part that had suffered for my independence and created a new life, resisted. Leroy, I began gently, this isn't our home anymore. This is my home, and I've created my life here, my social circle. You can't just come back and expect everything to be the same. But I'm your son, he said, a pleading tone in his voice. And legally, the house is still partially mine. I flinched. Was he threatening me the same way I'd threatened him and Nancy? Do you really want to go down that road? I asked quietly. Leroy blushed and lowered his eyes. No, of course not. I'm confused, Mom. I've lost my wife, my home, my old job. I feel like a loser who's ruined everything. You're not a loser, I've softened. You're a man who made mistakes and is now learning to live with the consequences. We all do. But can't you help me? He looked up at me with hopeful eyes. At least temporarily, until I'm back on my feet? I took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. If I said yes, everything would go back to normal. I'd be back to taking care of my grown son, solving his problems, sacrificing my own interests for his comfort. If I say no, I risk ruining our relationship forever. Leroy, listen. I chose my words carefully. I love you. You're my son, and nothing will change that. But you're a grown man who needs to learn to be on his own. Coming back to this house would be a step backwards for both of us. But where would I live? I could hear the desperation in his voice. My apartment is just a doghouse. I'm barely making ends meet since the divorce. I looked at him, so lost and miserable, and suddenly I remembered the day he and Nancy had offered to let me live in a tent. How easily he had accepted that humiliating offer. How willing he had been to sacrifice my comfort for peace of mind with his wife. And that's when it hit me. I have a suggestion, I said, trying to hold back a smile. If you need to live here so badly, you can stay in the tent in the backyard. Leroy stared at me, not believing his ears. What? The tent's still there. I shrugged. Sure, it's winter, but you said it was very warm. We can get you a heater. It's safe, it's battery operated, and you can use the bathroom in the house, of course. I deliberately repeated his own words to me at the time. I could see in his face that he recognized them. Are you kidding me? He asked quietly. Not at all. I shook my head. I'm just offering you the same thing you offered me. Isn't that fair? Leroy was silent, digesting my words. Then his shoulders slumped. I deserve it, he said. But you don't mean it, do you? You're not going to make me live in a tent? Of course not, I smiled. I'm not you. He flinched as if I'd hit him. Mom, I'm really sorry. If I could go back. But you can't, I interrupted him. None of us can. We can only move forward. And now what? He looked completely lost. You don't want me back. You haven't forgiven me. I have forgiven you, Leroy, I said softly. But forgiveness doesn't mean everything has to go back to the way it was. We've both changed in these months. I've found a new life, new friends. You've begun to learn to stand on your own 2 feet without Nancy controlling your every move. Going back would reverse all that progress. He was silent, staring into his coffee cup. Can I come over sometimes? He asked finally. Just for a visit, like today. Sure, I smiled. You'll always be welcome in my house. But a guest, Leroy, not a tenant. He nodded, accepting reality. After he left, I sat on the veranda for a long time, looking at the tent still standing in the corner of the yard. I didn't take it apart, leaving it as a reminder of what had led to the drastic change in my life. A week later, Delilah, Eleanor, Ruth, and I made the final decision to move in together. My house was the choice. It was large enough, one story, and well located. Ruth sold her house to a young family with children, Eleanor rented hers, and Delilah left her house to her youngest daughter, who was going through a divorce and needed a place to live. By the end of February, all 4 of us moved into the house. We divided up the responsibilities. Ruth, a former librarian with a love of order, took charge of organizing our shared household. Eleanor, a retired literature teacher, ran our shared library and cultural program. Delilah, once a restaurant chef, was in charge of the kitchen, and I, with my postal experience, handled finances and correspondence. We called our home the Wise Women's Shelter. Jokingly, of course, but the name stuck. We each had our own room, but we spent most of our time together, in the living room talking, in the kitchen cooking, in the garden growing vegetables and flowers. Leroy kept his word and came once a month. At first, he felt awkward among the 4 older women, but gradually he got used to it and even found common ground with Ruth, who shared his love of old movies. One day at the end of March, he arrived with unexpected news. I've bought a house, he announced over dinner. It's small, but it's my own. I took out a mortgage by myself without co-borrowers. Congratulations, I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. That's a big step. I want to sign over my share of the house to you, he said. Legally put it entirely in your name. I looked at him in surprise. Are you sure? Absolutely, he nodded. This house is yours. You've created something special here. He glanced around the kitchen where we were sitting together. Something real. 2 weeks later, we met at the notary's office and signed all the necessary papers. The house was officially mine. Thank you, Leroy said as we walked outside, for teaching me a lesson. It was cruel, but necessary. I didn't mean to be cruel, I admitted. I was just protecting myself. And you did the right thing, he smiled. You know, sometimes I think that eviction was the best thing that ever happened to me. It made me rethink my whole life. I nodded, realizing what he meant. Sometimes we need to lose something to gain something more valuable. That evening, I went out into the backyard and looked at the tent still standing in the corner. With the onset of spring, the first flowers were starting to break through around it. Are you going to take it down? Delilah asked as she followed me out. I don't think so, I said after a pause. Let it stand as a reminder. Of what? That sometimes you have to go to the extreme to start a new life, I smiled, and that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. Delilah put her arm around my shoulders, and together we watched the setting sun color the sky over Nanticoke in shades of pink and gold. The life I was leading now was not at all what I had envisioned after Harold's death. It was better, fuller, and it all started with a tent in the backyard.